Ladies and gentlemen, 10 minutes, a trip around the world. This is my task. Let's see how far we get. Ladies and gentlemen, dear MPs of the German Bundestag, dear colleagues and former colleagues, I see, Your Excellencies, ambassadors of many countries that are here in Berlin, and ladies and gentlemen, and especially Mr. Paulson, thank you very much, not just for your friendly words at the beginning, but also that you organized this forum for the 5th time, and this is also a process of reflection in Germany about German foreign policy, and we have not had that before. So thank you very much for that. And Jean, when I look at Jean Asselborn in front of me, then for him this is nothing new. As a representative of the current presidency, when I say quite doubtless, Europe is undergoing the greatest test of the 60 years of European integration. And I can only confirm what Mr. Paulson just said, that maybe never before, as today, the boundaries between domestic and foreign policy are merging. This is true for the cooperation towards the inside as well as the ability to act of Europe to the outside. We can only maintain both if we actually learn to manage the crisis and develop solutions which will help us in Europe. So how fast the time's changing, we've seen that over this year alone. So we've seen like a few weeks ago, a few months ago, we had the feeling still that the greatest crisis of existence of Europe was handling the Brexit and how to behave towards Greece. And this feeling didn't last for very long, as we know now. A few months later, we're now, without doubt, facing an even greater task for this Europe. Jean Asselborn has said in the Tagesspiegel, not quite without merit, that this crisis has the potential to actually divide Europe in the long run if we don't watch out and if we don't work on finding common solutions. So why is that so dangerous? Because this crisis is actually trying to shake the root what makes up Europe. So humanity on the one hand and the right understanding of solidarity on the other side. The Euro crisis and refugee crisis, these are, if I may say so, two aspects, but one finding. Europe, in both crises, Europe is facing a crossroads between a continent on which we either fall back into a logic of boundaries and Schlagbaum, or a continent standing together and acting together. And I agree completely with Jean Asselborn when he says, according to his analysis, he doesn't deny anything, it doesn't beautify anything, and the result at the very end is, because of the crisis, we don't need less Europe, but we need more Europe. So what does that mean? That means that we have to agree where and how we can accommodate those seeking protection and give them protection. And I like to recall what I say in other places. The right of asylum is not just a German fundamental right. If I rightly remember, it's also a basic value of Europe. So this cannot be the case that we're talking about European solidarity, that 4 or the maximum of 5 countries in Europe take on 90% of those seeking protection in Europe. So this is not my understanding of solidarity, but this understanding of solidarity would be met if we could agree in Europe to have a binding and permanent mechanism for the fair distribution of those seeking protection in Europe. But that is the one side of it, however. The second point is that indeed I believe, and this is what we're going to talk, no doubt, in the panel discussion, that in the attempts to find common European solution, we should not just talk about distribution, not just about the harmonization, about the right to asylum and immigration, about standards and procedures. All that is necessary, but we also have to talk about the relationship between the borders in Europe and the border out to the outside of Europe. Not that this is new, but you know yourself that the philosophy of Schengen actually consists of two parts. The one part is that we are able, so apart from taking down boundaries and borders, and also the free movement within the Schengen region without border checks, without passports. So that part of the philosophy of Schengen, we all accepted that gladly. Second part of the Schengen philosophy, however, has been forgotten a little bit meanwhile, and the second part of Schengen philosophy is actually right from the outset and always freedom within the Schengen region if the outside border protection is guaranteed. So this second part, as we all see, has been neglected in Europe, and that's why at the current situation we have to catch up. So this can not only be the task of the European presidency, of the Luxembourg presidency at the moment, but this is what we have to do together. On the one hand, Frontex with the necessary capacities, we need to give them the necessary capacities that they can actually fulfill their task. Secondly, we have to talk about the content, about the competency of Frontex, and we have to see the crisis as an opportunity not only to talk about Frontex, but also if we're talking about the management of this refugee movement, and once we've managed it better, how we handle the protection of our outer borders of Europe. So it's not that we should extend the discussion today already, looking into creating a common border control authority. I know what the discussion is going to be when we're talking about the outer borders. The people talk about the fortress of Europe, but we shouldn't enter into that narrow debate too readily, because it's not quite justified historically. So free movement within the Schengen region requires common protection of the outer borders of Europe. And it shouldn't be like that we want to shut down Europe. No, we want to restore the order that has been lost on the outer borders of Europe so that we can enjoy the freedom of movement and of Schengen and maintain that. And this is the only way moving forward in our conviction, and also convincing those European member countries who are still hesitant at the moment to join in the development of a common European immigration movement. So, I have to be brief. So let's assume that we in Germany manage everything that is possible within domestic policy. And let's assume that we have gigantic steps taken in Europe as well. More common ideas in the migration policy. So even if all of that has been achieved, we still have the result that we're only dealing with the symptoms. But the causes of refugee movements have not been addressed at all with that. And the cause of such refugee movement is that there's too many regions in this world where, due to war and violence, people leave their homes and see themselves forced to take flight. And that is the bridge which we need to briefly come to Syria, at least, and this, especially as Mrs. Hassel already asked up front, like, what about next Saturday, when you're going to meet the second time in Vienna? I can say there's no reason at all for optimism, and not for euphoria in any case. But what happened in Vienna last Friday, a week ago, that is at least the beginning of something where there's no guarantee, mind you, what the further development is going to be. However, after 5 years of civil war, we've got 250,000 fatalities in Syria, at least. Probably more than 12 million people have left their home and lost their home, 4 million abroad, and the remainder is somewhere in Syria taking flight from the fighting militia and armed violence. And in this situation, we're trying to break through the spiral of increasing violence is something we should do. Whether this attempt will be fruitful and successful, I don't know. That's not guaranteed. And if you ask me, 4 weeks ago, I wouldn't have dreamt that we would be able to get the United States and Russia together on the subject of Syria. On the contrary, after the military commitment of Russia and Syria, actually they drifted further apart. And 4 days before the first meeting in Vienna, I wouldn't have thought that we would be successful in getting Iran and Saudi Arabia around one table. So, in other words, that we were able to do that. And we were able to do that not just once, but there's a repetition next Saturday. That is something that I would call a sign of hope in a country and in a region where we've been used to for 5 years now to see awful news. So there's no firmly agreed roadmap, but at least there is a route that has been embarked on together and that needs to be detailed. This is not peace in Syria tomorrow, but it is a route that will lead to a partial de-escalation of the conflict, may lead to a de-escalation of regional and local armistice. And so this is to be used to find a way amongst those parties involved, like an interim government, and then to seek the route from there to a new constitution and later to elections. So I believe at the end of the day that is the only way of breaking through the cynical dynamism and break through that in the Middle East. That required a lot of tenacity to get to this point at all. But it does show that tenacity will bear fruit. Probably we're going, in the panel, we're going to touch upon certain conflicts. And I'm sure that in the hall there's very different opinions. But I've been in this business for long enough to say, on the subject of Iran, who would have thought that like after 10, 12 years of negotiations, we would ever be able to agree on anything. So in 2005, the first time in office, that's 10 years ago, I was involved in the negotiations for the first time. And I remember quite well how often they were interrupted, they were discontinued, and how often we were on the edge, on the brink of a military conflict with Iran. And it was this tenacity, or the foreign politicians say strategic patience sometimes, that was necessary. Well, it was there too, that at the end of the day, the negotiations were completed. So this was not just a conclusion. I mean, this was the ambition of the last days to actually being able to put aside the nuclear dossier and to so that Iran wouldn't take up the nuclear bomb in the future. No, but this is creating an option to get the Iran out of its rather destructive position within the Middle East and to move them into a policy, or to open up the possibility of a new policy where they can be a constructive partner. Whether this is going to happen, we're going to see with involvement of Iran in the Syrian talks. Second example, which is, I suppose, even more arguable, is the subject of Ukraine. I'm mentioning it because we're going to talk about it, and there's various favorite or familiar faces I can see here from Eastern Europe in the hall. I mean, we've had a long discussion whether with foreign policy, diplomatic tools, we should interfere or not, or whether there's enough hard sanctions and they will bring about the desired results in the end. We had that discussion, and you know what I believe, and my opinion is that there are situations in which you cannot do without political pressure. And if political pressure is not enough, you need to be prepared to also exert economic pressure. But I have understood foreign policy in such a way that sanctions never have the sense of actually bringing the other side to its knees, but rather to creating possibilities of negotiations. And these possibilities of negotiations have been created. And if you look back, and however dissatisfied I am with that condition, we're far behind the time schedule of Minsk, and we've got a lot of barriers to overcome that at the end. So to come to the elections next year and to handing back the border control to the Ukrainian authorities, there's a lot left to be done. And the fact that we're not there yet, we might still be dissatisfied about. However, the other question you have to ask as a foreign politician, and we have to ask, where would we be today with the Ukrainian conflict if we didn't have that process towards Minsk and after Minsk? So I think today we would be talking about a conflict in the Ukraine that is far beyond the boundaries of the confrontation lines now in the Donbass region. Thus, we need to consider that. At the very end, I would like to say that there's no guarantee at all. And foreign policy, the diplomacy, showing patience and tenacity will show success. But there are some examples that obviously it has been successful, that we went in the right direction in our joint efforts. Dear Mr. Paulson, the survey that you mentioned and the question that you asked, whether the review process we've undergone in the Foreign Office has actually been necessary at all, I think yes. And I'm more grateful than ever to Mr. Bagger and his people that we did undertake this. So we couldn't see the crisis coming, but we now have structures with which we can actually react better to the crisis than we were able to do with the structures of the past. So the review process was necessary, and from my point of view, it went well, and it's got, there was many members of my office that have talked with the general public about issues of the foreign policy, and I'm happy about the numbers that you've brought along, that the Germans are not just interested in foreign policy, as your survey has shown, but also that the readiness to become involved in foreign policy, also the understanding for such involvement, has increased a little bit at least. So I think that is also a result of the discussion that we've had in this hall and in other places in Germany. So this is not there is no domestic or foreign. I mean, I think the Germans have actually seen that in the refugee crisis. These are not any remote crises we're talking about when we're talking about the Middle East, about Syria. And so these conflicts have actually arrived in the living rooms of the Germans. When you see and watch TV news in the evening, it's also in the schools and the gyms everywhere where the refugees have arrived in Germany. Thank you very much.